Hello and welcome to Sex, Psychics and Psychedelics, Discovering Inner Liberation. My name is BananaJane Garnett. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, a lover of freedom and a relentless explorer of the mind. Please come join me on my journey in hot pursuit of inner illumination and liberation. For more about me, you can find me at the BananaJane on Instagram. Now let's dive in. My next guest is the wild and wonderful Loa Myst. Loa Myst is a creative activist. She makes medicinal media, and she's here to talk with me today about sexual abuse, sexual healing, and creativity at large. Welcome, Loa. You're a medicinal media maker and artist. Can you describe for the audience what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the shortest way, I always just say turning poison into medicine. So because media has in its heritage been really weaponized often as a narrative tool, a tool that is used to tell us how we should see ourselves and how we see ourselves in society, whether you are a woman, you're an indigenous person, or you're a man, doesn't matter. Everyone has been affected by media and how media has been used. We also know that media is amazing. It documents our lives and allows us to reach out and connect to one another. Of course, the media that most of us consume is wielded by, platforms, groups of people that do have an agenda and an incentive. And so a lot of that media does become a bit poisonous and toxic depending on who you are and what you're getting or not getting from it. So medicinal media is about using this tool, this beautiful, amazing tool of storytelling in whatever medium, for good, for love, for connection, for allowing identity to be something that is much more expansive than just the narrow-minded version of it that we often grew up with.
Beautiful. I certainly feel like, this would be music to the ears of all of the parents in the world at the moment who are, freaking out about what's going on with screens, or at least that's the way that I see it. And obviously it goes way beyond kids. But thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to get that sort of established as sort of your perspective and get a bit of a sense of what you're doing. And the other snapshot I want to get before we dive into the sexual healing of it all is just your life. I know that you're a real deal Californian, which I always treasure that because I'm kind of in love with California. Rare. It's great. So tell me, you grew up in LA?
I did, yes. I always say that the only place that my parents could have met would be Los Angeles, California, because my father is Croatian and my mother is Polynesian. Such an odd mix. So they met in LA. I was born and raised pretty much in Venice, Marina Del Rey, West LA kind of area. And then I really hated it, to be honest. I actually never really connected to California, and now I'm the most Californian, loving person in the world. But I think it took me traipsing all over the world to really appreciate it.
Were your parents in the arts?
Both of my parents are incredibly creative. My mother is more the producer side. She's always been the business maker of the artistic. She's very much like a patron-minded type creative person. My father is absolutely an artist person, but he also hated the lack of empowerment in having an artistic career. So because he had a big background in nutrition and fitness, like he trained Jet Li and he was a big martial artist, he did stunts and stuff like that a lot. So he kind of leaned into that aspect of it so that he didn't have to be stuck in the artist life that he wasn't really interested in. So they definitely were creative, they're deeply soulful, they appreciate arts, but they themselves kind of had different versions of that path.
So I see we're tapping into deep wells of grooviness here.
Yes.
That makes sense. Wonderful. Okay, so from the little that we've spoken, I see that you've had a very kind of dramatic story, or there's some very dramatic elements. The first that really struck me, obviously, was that you had a near-death experience. Was it in your early 20s?
Yes, I was 22.
Yeah. And psychedelics were involved in that?
They were, yeah, which was interesting for me to contextualize at the time. I think also because, there's so many reports now of people that have experienced near-death experiences, and there's a lot of similarities that people cite, and then there's also a lot of different intricacies. There's a lot of controversy around it. So I kind of hid that psychedelics were involved in my near-death experience for some time, because I thought that it would take away the validity of it happening. I thought that people would say like, oh, you were just tripping out. Yeah. But having been someone who had tripped out and know what it is to trip out, you can also really know when a very different, visceral, completely full body and psychological experience occurs that is different than anything drug or substance induced. The way that psychedelics were involved was that I had a toxic mold exposure very chronically for about 5 months. And it wasn't quite black mold, but the level right under. So I was inhaling all of those mold spores. Those mold spores had started to graft inside of my lung space. And because I was smoking a lot at the time, they were also inside my nasal passage.
Smoking a lot of tobacco.
Yes, tobacco and marijuana. Yeah. But it was just because I had been inhaling the mold spores in front of the fire through my cigarettes, which were basically, I was inhaling the ceiling, essentially. I was inhaling the mold in the ceiling through the hot,
This is a woman who really wants to get high.
It's like,
this is determination. Oh boy, that sounds horrible.
And I had no idea. I just started kind of feeling different effects of it, which again, at the time, 10 years ago, were really dismissed. But now there's so many different cases about toxins and toxic mold exposure, and it was all the things I was experiencing. So anyway, since all of that was unbeknownst to me, I was also experimenting a lot with psilocybin and psychedelics, mostly mushrooms at the time. And I kind of did many subsequent medicinal explorations with different people back to back, because I was so curious what it was doing for me psychologically in a very healing way. Tough love healing, but very healing and revealing. But then what happened was essentially I took a very strong dose. That dose then kind of crossed.
So wait, you took a strong dose of, this is the night that you had the near-death experience. You took a strong dose of mushrooms.
Yes.
And then there was an interaction between the mushrooms and the...
Exactly. I know it sounds so sci-fi.
It really is. And we got to make a movie about this. It's insane.
I know, everyone is like, what?
Yeah.
And again, I didn't know any of this was happening. So I'm just like a 22-year-old feeling kind of weird in my body in different ways that a lot of doctors can't describe. I was going around, some would say like, oh, you have a autoimmune, you have this. I was getting all these blood panels taken, and my blood levels were very different day to day. It's like they were jumping all over the place. So one blood panel would say, oh, it almost looks as if you have lupus or something that's really severe. And then the next week I'd be hiking the mountain in California and my vitals were fine. That's, again, if you look up different effects of toxicity and toxic mold and stuff like that in your environments, it really affects your adrenals and all different kinds of levels that are very mysterious in your body. So I took this very, very strong dose of mushrooms, and it was like the 5th time in a few months that I'd been taking dosages increasingly higher. And I never had a mushroom experience. I immediately started to go into this very odd, purely auditory space. The reason why I say that is...
So all your senses were shut down apart from your hearing, is that right?
Yes, exactly. So the reason why I knew it was different was because within the first, hour, there was no diversification of any of my sensorial reaction. It was really all kind of right, left brain hemisphere, almost as if I was listening to like binaural beats, where they kind of pan from one side to the other. And I then witnessed every aspect of my body recognition, my cognizance, all of that shut down layer by layer. And then, as I mentioned to you, I was in a room. I was standing upright.
Hold on one sec. Did you think you were dying?
I did not. No,
you didn't
I didn't. I thought I was sick. I thought maybe, I'm gonna purge. It's quite common when you're experimenting with different psychedelics in the beginning. Sometimes you can have really strong waves and you need to purge. So I was like, I think I need to purge. So I went to purge. But like I said, it was very interesting. Like very quickly, I would have my recognition wiped out. So I would look at something, identify like, I turned the light switch on, and then be looking at the light switch in utter confusion. Like, what is that?
Yeah.
I would be able to move my hand in a certain way and then all of a sudden lose connection to it. So again, if you're not familiar with psychedelics, it sounds like this might just be a trip, but there's a really cool TED Talk that a woman does who's a neuroscientist.
Are you talking about my stroke of insight?
Yes.
I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Yes. So that, yes. And there are a few other people like that who are neuroscientists, and they describe what it's like for them to witness their body in this experience. And that's what it was like for me.
For those who don't know, my stroke of insight is the account by a neuroscientist, first-hand account of a woman who's having a stroke, and she's watching her left brain get shut down and moving into her right brain, right? So there's that moment of holding the telephone, trying to call the ambulance, and not knowing what a telephone is or what a number is.
Exactly. She's kind of flickering in and out, of these learned capabilities and this brain, cognizance that we have, but she's trying to kind of keep a thread. So that's a bit what it was like.
So that was happening as these parts of you were getting shut down. Okay, and then what happened next?
Right. So then, like I said, I thought I was going to purge, so I kind of leaned down in front of the toilet, and my friends were just outside the bathroom with the door open, just, kind of making sure I was all right. And then the next thing I remember was that all the stripes on the wall, which were upright, all of a sudden were horizontal. I just remember thinking, that's so funny. How'd the stripes flip around like that? And then all of a sudden I realized I didn't feel ill at all anymore. I felt fine. And I remember thinking, I feel so much better. And then in that instant, I could see myself outside of myself as I felt no pain. And I kind of just felt this one primordial auditory hum. It was just like the hum of, sound, white noise, but in a kind of comforting way. And as I looked at myself, I thought, oops. And as I saw myself, my body structure there on the floor.
Were you on the ceiling looking down?
It was very gradual. So at first it was literally just as if I was standing above myself. Mm-hmm. And then as I was recognizing myself outside of my body, it was as if I was kind of hovering. I like to say it's like, if you've ever picked up a cat by the scruff of its neck, you can imagine that it gradually creates distance from the ground where it's come from. And that's what it felt like. It was very involuntary. It was like something was picking me up, really even by that same space in the back of, where your head kind of sits on the top of your spine. Yeah. And as I was getting more and more perspective, I was able to see the layout of the house. So I could see my friends in other rooms and what they were doing. And I could see, the coastline outside of the house where we were at. And I could see my car and on the street where it was parked. And I sort of had this mix of euphoria and confusion that was going on. And again, that feeling of being picked up by the back of my neck, higher and higher and higher. And I could kind of feel myself receding away from California, way up and above. And as there was this increasing almost ceiling of light behind me that it felt like I would be sucked into a tunnel of, when it reached kind of maximum capacity where I knew there's no way either up through that, I heard myself kind of say, not yet. And as I heard not yet in that instance, even though it feels like I was light years away, I stood up into my body and went and I was standing, like, as if you literally wake up from a nightmare and you're completely horizontal, and then you wake up and you're like standing up in shock in the room. And I woke up and I was standing in my body electrically. And my friend turned around and looked at me and she said, "Are you okay? I thought you were just resting. It was such a short amount of time. Are you okay?" And as she looked at me, I had absolutely no recognition of who she was, who I was, and how to communicate to her that I was very aware of life in this kind of vast sense, but I had no language. I basically had complete amnesia. And that lasted for about 5 hours. And as you know, maybe, when people are tripping on different kinds of psychedelics, they usually are about 5 to 7 hours. So if someone is incredibly quiet, nobody gets that worried, because a lot of times there are different ways that people can just be inward in their experience. And I'm a bit of a strange person anyway, so everyone kind of just left me to my own, not really worrying that I wasn't saying much. And that five hours was like a very interesting eternity of maybe creating the person that I am now, I guess.
So I know that this near-death experience is related to waking up to sexual abuse.
Yes.
Did that happen that night?
It didn't. The feeling of it did, but the awareness of it was gradual. So after that 5 hours, where I kind of completely surrendered, and I thought, okay, maybe I've finally done it. I've finally stretched my brain to maximum capacity. So I kind of surrendered. And in that moment of surrendering is actually when I started to have the same auditory experience as in the beginning. And in that panning back and forth of sound, eventually it was almost like a computer rebooting. I sort of got this like hit of my identity. I know this sounds bizarre, but it's like if you've ever seen the movie The Fifth Element, and she's learning about war, it's like flashing images that are coming to her. So it's interesting.
I haven't seen it. Is it of like her future identity?
It's like she's downloading information rapidly. So kind of the way that most people speak about near-death experiences where they see their life flash before their eyes, that didn't happen to me. I had my life flash back into my eyes. So
your future self came to you?
Well, I would say more that I kind of showed up in my body as my future self without any recognition of my past. And then my past was downloaded back into me. So that's what happened that night.
I see. It's sort of like you hadn't been in your body before, then you got put in your body, and then being in your body really, maybe for the first time or the first time in a very long time, connected you to some shit that really happened or started to connect you. Is that it? Okay, sorry if I'm being slow.
No,
it's very helpful. Kind of
it's
complicated stuff.
It really is. Yes, and I would say again, for someone who's listening to this, I really do sometimes encourage people to listen to it fictionally, because I think that sometimes having suspended belief is very helpful when we're contemplating things that are a little bit outside of the boundaries of what we believe reality contains. I was the kind of person who would not be having this conversation with you. Me then hates me now. Me then has no interest in any of this. Like, not at all interested in talking about, spirituality and wellness. And I mean, none of it. I think, again, that's why I love having this conversation, because essentially in the short version, anybody that grows up with trauma usually knows that it's very easy for you to exist outside of your body. They call it dissociation. You're often like not really present because your pain is so acute that to survive, you have to be able to manage. And then what happened was being so completely out of my body and then thrown back completely into my body downloaded this extra shelving of trauma that I had put aside. It's called dissociative amnesia. So when I kind of really came to that night, I was relieved, of course, to have my language, to have my identity, to be able to communicate with my friends. But I knew that something was different, and it was very scary to me. I felt like something else is in me or here, and I don't know what that is. And it ended up being my recognition of sexual trauma. So that process of that unraveling was actually about a year or a year and a half. But what I did know for sure were two very conflicting and confusing things. One, I knew from that experience that I had that energy, divinity, infinite intelligence, these kinds of things were undeniably real for me, and that everything was interwoven, and that there's an interaction between human beings and this infinite intelligence. We are not disconnected, which was a brand new concept for me. And all of a sudden, I knew it for sure. And I also knew that I had been exposed to or victim of some very, very dark and damaging things. And those two things were what I came back to this world with. And the 1.5 years was me trying to create harmony and peace between the two as myself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense to me that you can start looking at the dark stuff if you're resourced enough. I mean, this is a principle. Exactly. I don't know if you know about EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing way of working with trauma, which I actually do. But one of the main tenets of EMDR is that you want to fill the client up or help the client to help themselves access all of the best resources, the best feelings, the sort of the well springs of safety and joy inside themselves or outside themselves. It could be, it's just sort of really kind of meditating on those deepest connections that you have and the things that make you feel the best and the most alive. And when you can really tap into those, quite literally, you do tap into them, then it's easier to take that journey, knowing that you can kind of come back, knowing that you can kind of cross-pollinate in a way the very dark and the very light. And it sounds like, you found these two places on the map simultaneously, the very dark and the very light, which actually I feel like that's very related to death and DMT. And, that's an experience I've had with 5-MeO DMT, is being very stretched in both directions, feeling like you're going through some kind of physical death, and then also this amazing expansion of the spirit. So you got stretched. And then there's this, I can only imagine how difficult it was to kind of map, this middle ground and, or map, it's not just the middle ground, right? Map all the spaces in between the two. And, my heart is hurting for you knowing that something terrible happened. And I actually would like to, could you just tell us what it is so that we kind of rip that Band-Aid off and, what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I will tell you actually in a way that relates to what you just said. About EMDR. So luckily EMDR was one of the first tools that helped me during this time. So if we kind of rewind to the point where I have a sense that something has happened to me, but I don't know what it is, I sought out a therapist that I had known years back, but never really had any continuing experience with. And she started doing EMDR with me. After about, I think 2 or 3 sessions, I was walking down the beach one day, and with no attempt to be thinking about it, I just blurted out, I was raped. And in that moment, I paused and I just sat down and curled into a ball.
You said it
out loud,
out
without thinking about it consciously whatsoever. And I just curled into a ball on the beach and I wept for what felt like forever, because I knew the moment I said it that it was true. Though, of course, in my mind, it felt unfathomable. And I knew that it happened when I was young. That's also because I started waking up with dates, literal dates in my head. I would see photographs of people that had been in my life that I hadn't seen in years, and I would ask my family members or different people to kind of confirm, these things, and they all did, which again was very spooky and surreal to me at the time. And it was through the course of EMDR, first with her and then with another woman who became my practitioner for 5 years, that I was able to uncover a lot of these memories. I was molested from the ages of 3 to 6, and then I was raped in a separate instance at the age of 6.
Was it
the molestation? Yeah, the molestation were 2 family members together. And then the rape was a stranger, but done in a situation where I was in a family home and being watched by other people.
So you were also very young with the rape?
Yes, 6 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So thank you for sharing, and I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
And wow, it's just, this is so hard to grapple with, right? That these things happen, and it's the most terrible. And here you are, sharing your light and your experience with us, and wow, what a journey. So one of the things, apart from your bravery, that I think about in response is, when we're talking about the body, a lot of what was happening to you was before you were really cognitively developed.
Yes.
I mean, if we're talking about 3, you're not fully verbal at 3.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this really does go to the body knowing the score in the way that the mind can't. So what it goes to me as a practitioner is, how can you get to this stuff through talk therapy or through any kind of quote unquote normal method of trying? Because I think that there are many people who have a feeling of like, oh, there was a dark patch and something happened and I don't know, and I don't want to search because maybe I'll find something that isn't there, or maybe I'll make something up, or I'll accuse someone falsely, right? There are so many different doubts. And how do you actually kind of get the real information online? And I think, for you were brave enough to do this deep diving, and then there was this sort of weird, whatever this sci-fi element was, which, how did the mold contribute? How did the mold conspire to help you connect the dots in your own life? But you found this information in a way that was sort of undeniable. You really found the embodied truth.
I think what's so beautiful about what you just said is that a lot of people that I now work with, or that other facilitators that I collaborate with, what really unites us, whatever our modalities or our practices are, is making sure that information is actually landing in the body and being extracted from the body, as in listening to the body. The mind is magnificent, but our mental kind of way of perceiving the world, which again has been so overdeveloped, doesn't like pain because it actually isn't the thing that computes the pain. The body is actually not as afraid of pain as the mind is. We think that we're afraid of physical pain, but the body is an amazing transmuter of pain. And they often say that a lot of us will stay in damaged feedback loops or broken habits for our entire lives because we don't want to experience, 10 to 30 seconds of excruciating pain. But what happens when you do experience that through the body is there's this huge open spaciousness and this reservoir where so much can be mended back together. That's why, if it wasn't such an extreme circumstance of somehow inhaling mold spores and then having this bizarre experience happen and finding doctors, thankfully, who helped me through both scientific modalities and spiritual modalities, weave my body and my mind back together from the fringes, because that's where I was for quite a while, as you can imagine, I wouldn't have such a deep belief that it's possible for anyone and anything. And I do now meet many people that have been through incredible traumas. I mean, I've lived for 10 years in East Africa. That's where most of my community is. I spent all of my 20s there. And I think a huge part of that was because I was going through something like trauma treatment in my 20s for rape that had happened to me as a child. So in a way, I was having a childhood trauma occur to me in my 20s for the first time. And being somewhere in East Africa where that kind of trauma isn't seen as like a contagious disease, because so many people have trauma and exist through trauma, was actually so empowering and comforting to me, because I do believe it's a very westernized thing that we believe our trauma is, weakness or to be done in secret. And secrecy, secrecy. Privacy is beautiful, of course, to honor your privacy. secrecy is a breeding ground for a non-integrated body. It's the perfect place for all of these different little fears and self-sabotaging habits to thrive. Because if you're an integrated body, there are certain things that can't stay in your physical system. So again, with EMDR, for anybody that isn't familiar with it, if you experience it or you look it up, it's very much about making sure that you have a practitioner who is intuitive enough to know when your body is kind of also doing tricky things to get you a little bit outside of being totally raw and vulnerable.
Agreed. I think that the best EMDR practitioner is going to have some experience with somatic work,
Yes.
and attachment work. So I think that sort of intersection is really important. And I think, EMDR workers, although, you have to be a therapist before you become an EMDR practitioner, I really feel like with the EMDR, for me, it was thrilling because it led me to probably where my natural way is really, which is more energy work. And
Yes.
with EMDR, you get to track where things are stuck and where things are moving. And
Yes.
secrecy is, I was just thinking about it on a sort of energetic level, it's stagnation. They say, still water is where things fester, right?
Yes.
And I always think about that with like sort of alcoholism. It's like a pickling, it's a stagnation, it's not a movement. And I think this is why I'm so attracted to psychedelics, because they really fucking push things into flow and movement, right? They go straight for the blocks. They show you those blocks, in Technicolor. And so, I agree with you about secrecy. And of course, there's a reason why we keep secrets, and there's all that vulnerability. So there's no one way to kind of, deal with that. I guess it's a very particular process, how you reveal yourself and how you de-shame and who helps you. And I wish there was a very clear map on that. But tell me a bit more about that, like how you started to kind of, how you continued to become embodied in a way that was joyful, and what kind of people helped you and that kind of thing.
Yes. Well, in a way, I do feel there is a map for that. I believe that the map is your body. Mm-hmm. I am very fortunate that though I did grow up with a lot of, sexual and physical trauma, I also grew up from dance. I was dancing in dance academies from the age of 5. And so I was very, very familiar with what it's like to be in my body. And even though there was a lot of trauma stored inside of my body, I also had something to kind of lean into during that time when I was very confused and trying to unearth different secrets. So I always say to people, whatever your experience is, even if you are someone a little bit outside of your body, even just stretching or anything like that, will immediately bring you to something more. So for me, my body became my map because I was aware, of course, on an intellectual level, what the implications of sexual abuse would do. I was, though, still very much in the dark about what's the way that you actually ever heal through this. Like, am I going to feel broken forever? And it very much confused me as well, because I'd actually had many healthy sexual relationships in my teenage and adult life with, boyfriends and partners and things like that. And though I could kind of track where a lot of codependency and shame and things like that are a result of sexual violation were definitely popping up in my life, my sexual experiences actually did feel quite warm and healthy and loving. So in this time frame where I'm kind of, sitting here trying to unpack, wow, I now believe in God. That's completely new. I don't know what God is. I don't think I need to know exactly what it is. I don't need to know how to explain it, but I know it. I feel it in my body, and it wants to be acknowledged by me every single moment of every single day. That's all of a sudden what I'm doing. And in light of that, I was experiencing sexual abuse from someone who is actually a Satanist. So like on his Facebook now, even when I was uncovering these memories, I looked and there's like all of this different kind of demonic Satan worshipping imagery. And I thought, wow, This is so fascinating. I mean, could I have been delivered a more extreme version of what it is to feel like light in darkness, you know? So again, my body became my map. I started breathing every single morning and evening, mostly just because I didn't know what else to do, to be honest with you. I think anyone that's gone through trauma or lived with PTSD of any kind knows that a lot of your daily life becomes strangely impossible.
Yeah.
You know, things that are very seemingly average, things that any adult person should be able to do can become completely overwhelming. You can be totally triggered and blindsided, and it can spiral very deeply. So having my back on the floor.
Yeah, you said you were breathing, so we're talking about a kind of breath work practice.
Yes, but at the time I had no breath work tools. I just knew I needed to lay with my back having physical contact on the floor and breathe. So that was my first step, I would say. And the reason why I always say that as a first step, which seems so basic and rudimentary to people, is because we often do that, but we don't do it in a way where we're really listening at what is actually coming up in our body, not in our mind. So I would challenge myself to just let my hands move across my body while I was breathing. And I would ask my hands, like, show me where. Where is the pain? The way that you would almost to a small child that doesn't have, you know, dialogue or explanation if they have a fever and they're crying and you don't know what's wrong with them. I would let my hands show me where that pain was. And some days it would be one hand in the same space for hours, or it would be, you know, running along specific different parts of like my lymphatic system, or all these things that really do have scientific reasoning behind it. But my body knew. My body didn't have to go to medical school and learn Chinese medicine for it to know exactly where in my body there was unresolved trauma. And my medical exams did show that. There were organs that were depleted in certain areas from stress and adrenaline that had been worn down from PTSD, and my hands knew. So that immediately led me.
I have to interrupt. I just think this is so wonderful. Wow. I mean, I love it. I love it. How did you even get to this level of patience and slowness with yourself?
You know what? I'd love to pretend that it's because I cultivated that patience willingly, but the truth is that life humbled me down so hard. I had no other choice. I was so broken for a time in my life. I was just like listening to Alan Watts in the bathtub with you know, a soft, warm light, and my friends.
Darling, that's my life every day. Like, come on, seriously.
And luckily, I had been good to people and shown up for people in my life. So during this time, they really traded hands, making sure, you know, that I was going to be okay. It was like, it was a village. And if it wasn't, I'm very passionate about, you know, also trying to always be present for people that are going through these things, because a lot of us don't have that. It's how a lot of us end up actually in, you know, really destitute situations, because you can try to deal with trauma and you don't have any sort of way to live without waking up every morning and going to work in that way. So I was patient because I knew there was no other way. It was like, you know, Eckhart Tolle says, evolve or die. And that's what I was at. And I knew it. So with the breathing and the hand movements and stuff like that, I really then was able to let that divinity experience land in my body. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times, you know, we can have these kind of awe-inspiring experiences with God or divinity, whether if it's with DMT or just a dream or something, you know, but it can really stay in the upper regions of our intellectual system. And when I was experiencing my own body and the intelligence of my body, I was then able to really let that information land, like, oh, not only is there infinite intelligence, but that infinite intelligence is running through me somehow.
You know,
that was important.
I love what you're saying. It actually just brought a memory back online for me of when I did ayahuasca for the first time. And I had this moment where I felt light in my hands. You know, suddenly I could sort of see and feel healing white light in my hands. And there was this kind of directive, which is, it was sort of like, you're allowed to use this for yourself. And then I was directed to this scar that I have. So I had an ovarian teratoma, malignant teratoma, so kind of ovarian cancer when I was in my early 20s, and had it removed. Thankfully, everything was okay. I had an ovary removed and I had a long scar on my belly. And, I hadn't thought about sort of going for self-healing, because I was just sort of watching the cancer counts and doing all the things that we normally do. And then I'm in this moment in this ceremony, with light in my hand saying, you're allowed to put your hands on your stomach. And so I did it then, and I could feel light going in from my hands into my own scar. And it was just such a strange, it sounds so silly in a way now, like you're allowed to touch yourself. You're allowed to love yourself. You're allowed to heal yourself. You're allowed to use what you've got for yourself. And yeah, there's something about that really moves me. I think it's a sort of homecoming.
Wow, none of that is silly to me in any way. If anything, I actually think it's the totality of everything that we've talked about up until now. Let me tell you why I say that. Allowing yourself to be the benefactor of your own energy and your own beingness is exactly the power that has been removed from us for so long, not only by physical instances, different gender-related experiences, shaming, violations, but also what we were talking about in terms of media, identity, storytelling. For so long, we have been ashamed of using our own power for ourselves, so much to the point that we have turned that shame into disbelief. So now the shame is not even online. It's very much an unconscious shame, because the shame is to even believe that you have light in your hands, that you have power for yourself, that you have medicine within your own body, that it can be given to you and others. And we reaffirm that every time, which most of us, this is how we have most of our sexual experiences, is from a space of wantingness. What can you give me? How can I put something into you that validates this exchange? The entire way that we exchange energy is without the backdrop of that belief and connection to our own inner power. So you saying that is everything to me, because that is exactly the experience that revolutionized my world. It took me months also to believe in it. I thought it was a load of crap. I kept wanting to touch myself or breathe and move my energy around, and even around my body outside of my skin, like just the space around me. And I felt absurd because, again, I had come from this background, that like it was not at all interested in any of this. And it really wasn't until I actually did meet that practitioner, who sounds very much like yourself, and that she's a combination of coming from traditional therapy in some ways, but she's an energy worker. She's an intuitive. She's a quantum healer. And so she was able to really thread these worlds together for me. And I think that's really important as well, because a lot of these gorgeous conversations that happen about sex, psychics, and psychedelics, we lose people when it becomes so much about the intrinsic kind of intuitive, inexplicable experience of things. And that's not to say that I try to linger in the academic justification of anything, because I don't feel like that's where my place is. But I do feel that having these kinds of conversations that bridge the gap is so important. For example, even speaking about different kinds of sexual healing can be seen very much as kind of like this abstract, like, what is that? That's some like just Burning Man person, whatever.
Right, groovy MDMA.
Exactly.
It sounds nice.
Exactly. And then, at the same time, there's MDMA that's being used in psychotherapy sessions for people to heal PTSD and deep grief and marriage counseling and all these kinds of things. So for me, that energy that you described, that light in your hands, is the same energy that we tap with sexual healing. And that's what I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand, is that your sexual healing isn't only about sex. That is a beautiful part of it. Yeah. So to come back to your question in terms of, what kind of helped me heal and unfold during this time, it was a variety of things. One of them was sex. Ironically, most people would think while you're going through trauma therapy for rape, sex is not going to be a healing thing. The reason why it was for me, and again, I feel just so divinely blessed by this, is that I had a longtime friend who was a deep, the way that a male friend, you have zero doubts if they are just for you in completion. They're absolutely just for you. And him and I became romantic during that time, but it was completely just love, friendship, and then this beautiful sexual healing exchange. And because of that experience, in connection with doing my EMDR and my spiritual energy work and my breath sessions and my crying alone in my bedroom and my journaling work and going and seeing psychics for the first time in my life, who I at first didn't believe in, but then had no choice but to believe in, all of that collectively together is really what created that healing experience for me.
Yeah, I'm really glad you spoke to all the parts, or at least some of all the parts, because I bet there were more as well. Because I think that's something that I've noticed. I came from definitely a not healing background. I was in the film business, and I was like, well, I will just, I'll never talk about goddesses, and I'll never get into crystals, and I'll never, I'll never do a podcast called Sex, Psychics and Psychedelics. Anyway, so there was all of that stuff going on. And then, then I get into therapy, gateway drug. And then as I learned more, I realized there's so much more here than therapy. And unfortunately, I think you can make wonderful change with the right therapist, or you can have a lot of support. I don't think it's enough. I think if you want to make real change or address significant trauma in your life, I think it takes a village. It is like raising a child. You're having to re-raise yourself. You're having to regrow yourself. You're having to allow parts to die off. You're having to, nourish malnourished parts. And how do you do that? A lot of different ways, and I think a lot of it's sort of trial and error as well. You just don't really know, what the younger undeveloped parts of yourself are going to need or respond to. I mean, I think over time you become more intuitive, and you learn how to respond to yourself better, and you learn to be a better parent to yourself, a better friend to yourself. But again, these are kind of new ideas to right, to the old self. That's a new idea, how to talk to yourself kindly. Like that wasn't even a thought right?
I was like, what? It's so interesting actually, you saying that. I did want to bring in one more piece that I now realize was so instrumental to me, that I probably overlooked the most, which was that before all of this kind of heightened time of healing, there was a time just before when I was going through, like I said, some symptoms of the toxicity and stuff like that, but hadn't yet had the near-death experience. And I also came from more traditional media and acting, film, music world, and I was taking vocal lessons for the first time in my life just for fun, because it was before I sang professionally. And in my vocal lesson, I notice now, looking back, that that's actually also where a lot of my trauma was awakened, because my body, if you think about it, honestly, we have this pipeline of energy that's running through our body, which again is also scientific. If you look at it, it's reflected in our anatomy. And when you're breathing and you're vocalizing and you're intoning, you actually need to be able to have a clear passageway in order for any of that cycle to happen. It was very clear, very fast, that I did not have a clear passageway, and I couldn't figure out why. And it was many things, but one vocal teacher in particular was trying to get me to sing softly. So she asked me, imagine if you were singing a lullaby, and she tried a few times before I could see in her eyes that she was aware I had no idea how to sing to a child, because at that time I had no healthy relationship with the concept of interacting with a child, particularly my own inner child. And I remember when I really started to wander into the door of inner child work and remembering that moment, like, oh, that makes so much sense. Of course, I wasn't able to open my voice up and in a clear, honest, vulnerable way express softness to a child, because I had no relationship of softness with my own inner child. So I bring that up because I also think vocalizing and singing, and the fact that I have been singing now for 10 years has been so important to me, even though I probably did a lot. I just only recently started, studying sound healing and getting certified in those areas. But of course, it's been part of that tapestry as well. The voice is so powerful for revealing and healing too.
I agree. And it's so interesting that singing is a fundament of spiritually healthy cultures, as a way to commune, but I think also as a way to release. It was actually, I went through a Christian phase when I was about 11, and it was really what sort of attracted me. I thought, well, if you can get together with a group of people and sing in a beautiful space, why not? I'll, erase the parts I don't don't get so much, but yeah.
That's so funny as well, because actually you've just jogged my memory that I went through two brief, like more traditional religious phases when I was younger. When I was 8, I was kicked out of the Mormon church. It's so telling now if you think about it, because it was a class called Little Women's, and we were learning about how Eve, was crafted from the rib of Adam. And I, in my young, brave naivete, said, please explain this to me, because it doesn't make any sense to me that a being that's whole unto herself and has her own anatomy and the capacity to create other humans would have been created out of the rib of anything. And I was kindly invited not to come back. I accepted that invitation. It feels very much feels like a foreshadow to my life. But then later, I had a cousin who was into the Christian side of things, and I asked my mama, I wanted to be baptized, and she was smart. She knew about my tendency to get really intense about phases. So she said, why don't you wait a few years and then, of course we can discuss it. I'm glad that she said that, because what was revealed is what I loved was the ceremonial aspect of it. I loved that there was, different things being burned and drunk and shared and chanting and cloaks being worn and this communion happening. And then, of course, later, getting into different forms of spirituality, I thought, oh, this makes so much sense. It really is, again, what we're speaking about. It's not just hearing sermons or digesting things intellectually. It's the body, it's the senses, it's really sensual. Exactly. Yeah, it's sensual spirituality, which is thought to be two different things, but it really is the same experience when it's done in wholeness.
I agree. I want to just ask you about, so again, sort of to get some different kind of snapshots and angles on sexual healing. As you went through this sexual healing journey, did sex change for you with other people? Did your fantasy life change? And did your sexual relationship with yourself change? I mean, I think I know. I
love this question. Love this question. Okay, so firstly, sex did change for me with other people. Interestingly, because though I had this really healing experience, like I said, with my friend / lover, I also became very acutely aware that when I wasn't having aligned sexual experiences, I felt physical pain from sex, which I had never felt before. And that to me was, very confusing. It is said that a lot of times if you've had sexual trauma, you can actually feel psychosomatic or physical pain because of the experience. But it wasn't consistent. the beautiful gift in that was that, like I said, it really allowed me to understand that when I was having aligned connections that actually did have space for vulnerability and trust, I felt no pain. I felt complete freedom. And it really censored out any experience that wasn't that. So that is how I would say that it actually did change. I think that what's really interesting to say about this as well is that I've always been someone who seems more sexual than I was aware of. I had someone read my palm when I was 16 years old, and she's this awesome Russian woman who used to be like an astrophysicist, and then she started being a palm analyst. And she said, "You're very sexy, but you don't know it, and that might create pain in your life." And I said, "Please explain." And she said, "Well, your energy is sexual. It comes out of you as if it's an invitation or an advance, but you don't know it and you don't mean it. So then when people respond to you in a certain way, you get confused, they get confused, everything gets weird. So you should be aware of that." So again, that was when I was 16, and it didn't really come back into play until years later when I started to come online, like, oh, I understand. Yeah. So what also really shifted for me was my relationship to boundaries, which I'd never had before, because if you are someone that's been violated, you probably don't have a relationship to boundaries, and you usually think that in order to be giving or loving or kind, you actually can't have boundaries because that's rude and offensive. Yeah. So you either have no boundaries, or you completely withhold and like kind of antagonize people. So all of a sudden, I think what happened for me was my awareness that I can actually set my own boundaries, change my own boundaries. And in terms of sexuality, what that meant was becoming very comfortable having, conversations about what I did and did not want. Yeah. And sometimes also, again, when I work with other women, because we all know what it's like when you're in the middle of a situation where it just feels too awkward to say what you do or do not want. A lot of that work can be making the decision before you go somewhere to really ask yourself, like, okay, I might be attracted to this person. I might even have some sort of, fantasy experience about connecting with this person. But what right now do I know I probably am not comfortable with? Yeah. And how can I then make that decision in my energy before I even get there? And the reason why I say that is because then when you do experience the situation, you're not relying just on your words to back you up. You already have the intention, feeling. Yeah. Yes, you have an actual feeling in your body to connect with, so that you have that extra support inside yourself.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about that, because it's so easy to get into that kind of slippage of, oh, okay, they're touching me just a little too hard, or it's not really happening, but overall I like the situation and I like this person, and I don't want to make them feel bad, and then every time that happens, right? Yeah, and then you're really feeding disconnection. Yeah. So I do think that is a practice. I mean, I feel like I'm still working on that. I've come a long way, but it's also just, being a kind and sensitive person. You don't want to hurt someone else's feelings, and there's all of that stuff.
That's a huge part of it. And I think also, again, it was really reframing how I thought of boundaries. So the idea that having a boundary with you actually means that I do want to be kind with you, and it means that I care enough that I want to be honest with you. So if I'm setting this boundary, it's because I want there to be more. I'm not saying no to more. I'm just saying maybe not in this instant.
You're saying yes to real. You're saying yes. A real value. You're assigning a real value to yourself and to them, and to the possibility of what might happen in the future if you're real with each other.
Yeah, and I think you're assigning a real value to your intuition, which is, again, your body, right? That's a very, it seems like a simple, but it's an intricate process for so many of us that don't feel like our bodies are really ours, or, again, minimized. It's not that big of a deal. We live in such a casual kind of over-sexualized culture. And so when someone might feel that sense after, if they've given consent or didn't even feel asked for consent, or if they ended up sleeping with someone, or they did something that they didn't really want to do, that can sometimes be the trickiest thing to detangle, because it's not outright like, oh, in my experience, someone raped you. That's very obviously a violation.
Yeah.
But sometimes our violations are connected to ways that we violate and abandon ourselves. And those are the ones that I think are the most ripe for our own sexual healing, that can really deepen our connection with ourselves by looking at different times in our life that we have regretted ways that we've interacted with people, or even just looking in the future of, okay, moving forward, how would I like to feel after a sexual experience with someone? How would I like to, talk to that person after? Do I want to talk to that person after? Because there's nothing wrong also with sometimes feeling like you have just a spiritual and energetic connection with someone. But I think, again, these boundaries are things that if we're not practicing them really before and after we're in the space, it can be really tricky, because we just set ourselves up to be angry at ourselves that we didn't do it perfect under pressure, and no one does. So I think that's a big part of it. Then the most powerful way that sexuality has changed for me has been my relationship to self-pleasure. It really connects with what you were talking about in terms of feeling light and energy in your own hands. I think that, first of all, as we know, most women are not really given permission to feel that self-pleasure is something that we should participate in, especially not that we should talk about. And I think that those things are obvious barriers, but the subtler barriers that we don't really speak about is enjoying our self-pleasure when it's not just based on fantasy of someone else. This connects to what you asked about fantasy. So first of all, with fantasies, I have had so many beautiful, liberating experiences with other people that are also sexual practitioners and, sensual embodiment healers that revolutionized my life, because it gave me the permission to trust and believe in fantasy. I went through an era where a lot of people that I was working with who were beautiful practitioners really shamed having any sort of use of fantasy, because they felt like it's a version of escapism. It's a way of wanting to disconnect, not be in the body, all of these things. And that's a very fine belief system, and I respect it if it's working for different people. But it never sat right with me. I'm very much like, I come from theater. I'm an imaginative person. I believe in all these different aspects and experiences of myself.
Yeah.
And to feel like that's, just some sort of backward psychology that is indicative of me being unhealed never sat right with me. It just didn't work.
Au contraire, it's rocket fuel.
Right?
Fantasy is really serious business. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that's what I would say to that, is that whatever fantasies come up for you, again, you can have your own internal process using your hands on your body. What can be cool is it's your own form of kind of doing some, somatic work that you can say, like, is this fantasy actually something that's for me? Or is this something that was kind of imprinted because of something else? Did I absorb that from some other experience? Like, is this actually a fantasy that connects to me? And you'll usually know instantly if something really does genuinely light you up and like kind of juice you up. For some people, it might be role playing. For others, it might be, having multiple partners. It might be all different kinds of things. And I think that, again, all of this to me is best done after you've established a very strong connection with yourself and your own body. Because without that, it can be very confusing, and then again, sometimes end up in situations where maybe you did feel like a fantasy was for you, but then you participated in something that wasn't necessarily healing for you. So I don't think you have to have like a quote unquote perfect connection to yourself, but I think having just some line of communication, some way of being your own inner pendulum and knowing, is this really something I want to do?
Well, yeah, I think that we can learn a lot from our fantasies, and I
Yes.
would encourage just having awareness of,
Yes.
you know, where the fantasy is. Are you in the fantasy?
Yes.
I mean, I remember waking up to that I wasn't in my fantasies. It was like pure voyeurism. I was watching all sorts of shit go down. I was like, where's Jane? You know? She's everywhere, but nowhere. And, you know, and then, you know, kind of starting to come online in my own fantasies. Yes. Wow, that was cool, you know? Yes. And I feel like it's an ongoing thing, you know, and I think you can play with them. You know, we're the filmmaker here, and it's a great place to experiment. And, you know, does the fantasy always have to be about sex? Maybe it starts with sex and it ends up with that incredible thing that you want to make, that incarnation, you know, you want to develop. So I think that there's masses of potential in fantasy. And I think that the trick is, can we play with them a little more, like be less rigid?
Yes, and there's a gorgeous book that I'll give you to maybe include in the show notes. It's called The Soul of Sex. It's like my Bible. What's so beautiful is that the focus of the book is all about how sex is an invocation, and it's an invocation of this inexplicable sexual energy, and that when we have beautiful sexual experiences, if they're with others, if they're with ourselves, if they're just purely in fantasy land, usually we can trace back and realize that those palpable, most amazing moments is because we invoked this energy that is the actual energy of, you know, sexual connection itself, and then we kind of let ourselves be that vessel, and that energy ran through us and came through us and this other person. The reason why I say that is because, again, I think having fantasy experiences immediately drops us into that realm of imagination where there is so much fluidity and openness and spaciousness for us to be inside the thing, outside the thing, you know, where the paint itself, where the hand moving the paint, where the canvas, where the entire experience, which again, in any sort of spiritual experience, that's really kind of the 360 simultaneously reality. You know,
that's moving into oneness, right? That's oneness.
Exactly.
Yeah, so, I love that.
Yeah, and I also love how you talked about coming online to being in your own fantasies, because that's actually what led me to my healthy relationship with self-pleasure. I at first had, fantasies that began more with like, oh, me and this male partner, and then, adding another woman, because that is much more acceptable. And that's something that obviously my partners in the past had been okay with. So, okay, I'll add that.
Right. And she becomes the surrogate for that extra bit of sexuality that you've disowned.
Because it's at least a bit accepted and doesn't have to, trigger my total shame that can come with the big openness that we get when we start to be turned on by so many different things that we're told aren't supposed to be sexual.
Right.
So that was kind of the beginning part. And then it was, maybe, maybe it's just me and the woman. And then there was that whole chapter. And while all of these different things I've passed through still I find delicious and wonderful, really what it ultimately became was me self-pleasuring myself in front of a mirror for the first time and realizing, wow, I feel so relieved, because that was the whole path I had to travel, through the lens of the man, then through the lens of woman to woman, being watched by the man, then through the lens of just woman to woman, and then that woman to woman being myself.
Me and you, you, yourself, and you, 100%. I've had the same journey, and it's a sexual homecoming. It's a good one. I like it.
Yeah, and I think it's very much, it can't necessarily be forced as well, because there are so many intricate layers that we have in our psychology.
It's definitely, I was going to say, this is a journey through codependency.
Yes.
Right? It's I find it, where is it? I mean, I'm writing a book about this. The first part is in love with men. The second part is in love with women.
Yeah.
The third part is in love. It's me, but it's it's just in fucking love, just being able to be in it, which you can only really be in it if you're not trying, if you don't think another person holds it. And I think you don't think another person holds it if on some level you didn't feel like another person took it.
Yeah, and this is why you saying that in that way is why I know that for myself, again, it's a controversial belief, but I know for myself that I chose to walk into this life and very consciously chose that trauma path before I got here. Because had I not had someone take from me something that actually can never be taken in its totality, but can very much be taken in certain forms, and then being called to retrieve that for myself and experience that homecoming, I would not have any capacity to be able to, first of all, feel it for myself, but second of all, stand up shamelessly and have this conversation with so many different people who are having the conversation with themselves, and maybe a couple people here and there, but who are still, wrapped up in so much of our own freedom and power that has been taken from us. And I would just say that if anybody is in that space, I think the most beautiful thing is to trust in the knowing that power cannot be taken. It can just be seemingly temporarily removed.
Put on the shelf.
But the beautiful thing about it is that it's kind of like waking up also consciously and spiritually, that at first you kind of condemn yourself whenever you forget or you fall back into a habit or something. But the beautiful part is every time you reawaken, you awaken with more.
You awaken with more. Yes.
Yeah, you awaken with more. And
it's a fractal homecoming.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, this is such good stuff. I'm so happy we met. And thank you, Ashley, out there.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. I get it. This is why she was like, you must.
I know. She was right, of course. Okay, what I would like to do is close with 2 questions.
Yes.
Your greatest ongoing challenge and your greatest hope/prayer. The big
okay.
ones. Yeah.
What's so cool is that these 2 questions connect to my greatest ongoing challenge and prayer. So it's kind of the same answer. My greatest ongoing challenge is really anchoring within myself the belief that women can prosper from a heart-centered space, completely free within themselves, and also be global game changers, movers and shakers at a level that is usually dominated and held by non-women. Let's just put it that way. I know it inside myself, but I also know that day to day, the ongoing challenge would be anchoring that in every single thing that I do by not allowing my limiting beliefs to shape all the things that I'm creating. My biggest hope and prayer is that as I continue to bust open beliefs inside myself and have conversations with women like you and create and build communities and businesses with other women, that we multiply all of our collective belief, and in ways beyond what we can imagine right now within our lifetimes, and for our children, see how possible it is to allow the divine feminine to thrive in a very tangible world. And both of those things are kind of connected to the community I'm building right now called Unlock Your Legend. It's all about women really claiming and owning their own myth, their own archetypes, their own legend, and not believing that we are just someone else's story, even though we can be mothers and daughters and partners and all of those things, but that we're really our own legends, and that all of our legends are to be lived in totally different ways. So my challenge and my prayer are very much interwoven, and I'm just living through both of them.
Unlocking the legend. Well, count me in.
Great.
Count me in. So great talking with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Lots of love.
Lots of love.
Bye, Danny.
Bye.